Russia's President Vladimir Putin has described the Ukraine situation as, quote, gradually stabilizing. And that seems to be easing investor concerns that any conflict could erupt. The price of crude oil fell by more than $2 a barrel on Wednesday to close at about $101. Now, the possibility of U.S. or EU sanctions against Russia has sparked some concerns that the oil supply to parts of Europe could be interrupted. Russia was the world's second largest oil producer in 2012 and is the top exporter of natural gas. And for more on the Ukrainian crisis and its economic impact, we're joined by Charles Ortel, Managing Director of Newport Ventures. Charles, good to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's start off with the EU's aid package to Ukraine, worth about $15 billion, $25 billion if you look at the whole package together. How is this going to help?
See, I think really very few people know the true dimensions of where we sit right now. After all, 2 weeks ago, Russia had proffered a $15 billion aid package. Then when the conflict started, people were talking about Ukraine really needing $35 billion. The key dimension is how much, what is going to be the price of Russia's gas going into Ukraine in either scenario, if Russia does not cooperate or if Russia does cooperate. That's a big, big variable. And the second one is, what is Ukraine's economy actually based upon?
Right. Well, here's the deal. We've been talking about sanctions from the U.S., potentially EU sanctions, but of course the EU is in a bit more of a vulnerable position because it's dependent on Russia for natural gas. How dependent is the EU?
The EU is very dependent on Russia for supplies of natural gas, and those supplies won't change soon. You can't snap your fingers and make the energy situation change for the better for either party. So I think the threat of sanctions coming out of the EU and the US is actually very weak, and the Russians know it.
It's a weak threat, especially considering one could say President Obama's words have been a little empty in the past if we reference the Syria crossing the red line scenario. So if the US had to enact sanctions, they would have to be very quick and very effective. How likely is that?
I think it's extremely unlikely, and I think that people are not taking Russia's words about threatening the U.S. as seriously as they need to take them. I mean, when I look...
So you think there's a bigger chance that Russia will threaten the U.S. more so than the U.S. will threaten Russia?
Well, Russia has already threatened the U.S. I mean, if you take a step back, you mentioned Syria and you didn't mention Libya and Egypt. I think Putin and the Russians have a valid...
There have been a lot of political standoffs where Russia has, many would say, trumped the U.S., trumped Obama.
And importantly, in the Ukraine case, where the United States asserted in the case of Syria that one thing was going on and that was the basis for our intervention, and then very quickly had to change course. So I think Russia's advisors, some senior advisors, have been pointing out that the United States Federal Reserve System is not that strong. The deficit is not under control here. And Russia does have some tricks up its sleeve.
So let's talk natural gas for a minute, because Republicans are saying now is the time for Obama to stand firm and to say, you know what, we're going ahead with the Keystone Pipeline, which of course will take time to happen, but does kind of at least put some stake in the ground. What do you say to that?
I think we really should. I mean, people make a lot of fun of Sarah Palin, some justifiably, but I mean, she said way back when in 2008, drill, baby, drill. We should have been doing that from 2008 forward. We absolutely should approve the Keystone Pipeline. All of this threatens Russia, and it does, in addition, threaten the Middle East. So you can understand why the tensions would be rising and continue to rise.
At the same time, though, we've seen a bit of a dip in oil. It did have a slight rise today, down about 0.5%. What's going on with that?
Well, people are watching it day by day. The problem is that the announcements that Putin makes and that other advisors make are purposefully, I think, in some ways contradictory. And we had the most alarming thing that I heard coming out of Putin was that, and the Russians, they're not in control of the forces in the Crimea?
Well, yes, Vladimir Putin says that they are, quote, independent forces. But in the interim, the markets seem to have calmed down a little bit as well today.
Yeah, I think the markets are heavily, there's thin overall volumes in most commodities, most equities, most bonds, and there's a heavy influence of algorithmic trading and big central banks, trying to move things one way or another. When you go to fundamentals on this crisis, Russian-affiliated troops have seized territory in the Crimea, and so far, we haven't made any progress in getting them out of there.
If the U.S. was to take sanctions, any action on the sanctions front, what form would they take?
Well, they're talking about trying to make life very difficult for Putin via the oligarchs. A lot of the wealthy Russians have assets outside of Russia, and the theory would be that if we seized them or put liens on them or otherwise made it difficult for these oligarchs to travel, suddenly Putin's support internally would evaporate inside Russia. I think that's a weak argument.
However, there's a strong argument to make that Russia has a lot of pull on the other side because Russia is the EU's third biggest trading partner with goods and services worth more than $500 million exchanged in 2012. Would this actually hurt the EU more than Russia if Russia were to retaliate, if there was like a freeze in economic ties?
I think it definitely would. I mean, I think the largest question here is one that, the United States should really think about. We've been pushing this idea of regime change, not just under Obama, but beforehand. And look where it's gotten us. It's a dangerous concept to have foreign powers decide whether a regime should be overturned outside their own borders. It didn't work for us in Egypt. It certainly didn't work in Libya. It's not working in Syria. And now look at the Ukraine. I really think we should listen a little bit to what Putin has to say about what he thinks may be going on inside the Ukraine, because it's possible that we don't really have it right yet again.
So you're saying it's possible that the people in the Ukraine do want Russian-backed leadership and Russian support, which was what triggered these protests in the first place when they opted for the Russian deal as opposed to the EU deal.
Yeah, I think the simple answer is that, they had an election. Yanukovych, in theory, won that election. Right. He was the legitimate leader. We had these protests in Kiev. I've been to Kiev many times. It's a beautiful place, and it's sad to see what happens there. But the fact is that nobody today knows who were behind those snipers.
Charles, very quickly, you're pro-gold in all of this.
Yes, I am. I think that, the gold price has been suppressed for a while.
It was down today, though.
It's down a little bit, but in the last 4 weeks, it's up solidly. And I think in this conflict, I think you're going to see inflation rise around the world. And I think you're going to see investors run away from fiat currencies and get more interested in gold.
Back to that safe haven of gold. All right. Thanks, Charles. Good to have you back. Charles Ortel, Managing Director of Newport Ventures.